All right, now, can you hear it now?
Yeah, it looks
Better?
closer.
Because
Yes.
it's back, but I'm also closer to the screen. But I
Yes.
still don't hear you through my headset.
No, you
Select a
can.
speaker. Okay, try this now. Now do I hear you?
Yes.
Say
I don't know. Yes.
ah. Okay, now I hear you better.
Okay. And can you see any difference? Because now I'm streaming. Now it's online in YouTube, in Facebook as well.
Oh, it's already streaming before we
Yes.
start?
Yeah, just to test,
Oh, okay.
because sometimes if I have to do something, and if I have to change something, it costs me at least 5 minutes. So it's good
Okay,
to.
well, it seems to be okay now. It doesn't make a difference.
That's what I learned, because I'm used to stream my lectures.
Yeah?
And I realized that I need to start at least 10 minutes before, because if something happens before, I need at least 5 minutes to reboot or to
Yeah,
close
yeah,
and
that's
open.
true. I'm
So
just trying to do the lighting.
yeah,
Is that
well,
better? No. It makes more shadow. Okay, I'll
yeah.
take that away.
What I gonna try to do after with the recording, it is to put some captions, because, for example, people from the other side of the world, they were telling that they were only able to put Russian captions to what Anatol has presented.
Really?
Yes.
Okay. But I think we should definitely have the link and put it on the website.
Yes. Yes.
Hi, Mark. Are you there? Ah,
Yes, I guess I am.
Hi, Mark.
Hello, Eloise.
Hi.
good.
So I will try to work on two screens, like one YouTube, one, as Gregor suggested, one Zoom. So on Zoom in real time, listening to your talk, and on YouTube, trying to respond to questions that people ask in real time. I don't know how this will work. First of all, I'm not sure that I can answer all these questions, because they may ask some clinical stuff. So
Why don't they ask the questions to me, or you tell me the question and interrupt you?
Well,
I'll
they
answer the
ask
question.
a lot. During Tolya's talk, there wouldn't be time to answer all those questions. They asked me questions about the role of gamma motor neurons in equilibrium point control. What do they do? And there were several of those, to my surprise. Do gamma motor neurons also work on the principle of equilibrium point, not only alpha motor neurons? So there were questions.
Oh, okay, but I mean, certain questions you would try to. Also, I only have 57 slides. So for an hour and a half, I think we're going to be okay. And I certainly won't mind to be interrupted.
But anyway,
It's my usual talk. You've heard it before.
My students, they will gather all the questions anyway, even if because I know that Gregor and now Mark, they were going to look at the questions, but my students, I have two students in Facebook and other two in YouTube. They are responsible to send me all the questions.
Good, that's great. I really think we should put those together with the presentation on the ISMC website, and we'll populate the ISMC website with some content about that. I think it's important.
Something that I thought, maybe sending to Anatol the questions that people have made during the presentation and asking him to write down a paragraph for each one.
That's a very good idea too, and I'm sure he'll be happy to do it.
Yeah, that really sounds like a good idea, because my answers were, first of all, they were knee-jerk reactions.
And fast,
in real time.
Let me just call Anatol.
Of course.
Yeah. Let me call him.
Yeah. Go ahead. Luis, so what should I expect? Should I expect to use chat in Zoom and respond to questions in Zoom, or should I jump to YouTube and back?
No, I think that you should stay only in Zoom, and we can do what we have done before.
Okay, so you filter the questions, send them to me, and those that I can answer, I will.
Then
all right.
Give me from one connection to
on the floor. No, over there. No.
if you switch from one connection
Totally,
to another
stop.
you may
Earphones.
lose the context of the presentation. Although probably what Mindy is gonna talk.
Oh yeah. I'm not afraid of losing the contents of the presentation, so don't worry about that. I more or less am prepared to what Mindy is going.
Right after Saturday.
No,
Hi,
this is not
Nato.
working.
Good to see you.
Okay, he doesn't hear you because he's not on the headset. So I'm going to have to take the headset off. No, just until we start.
Yeah, Mark.
All right, just a second. Here, headset.
And then Paul.
Привет, дорогуша. Оля. Oh, he cannot hear.
Yeah, he can hear now.
Yes.
Hi, you guys.
Hi, good to see you. Good to see you. Yes.
You're sitting outside your own? Are you sitting outside or that's a fake background?
Fake. No, it is a picture of the background just an hour ago.
Okay, very nice.
It won't get dark.
Nice.
Oh yeah, it's probably dark there.
Not yet, but.
Okay, so how many people are we supposed to have
on this active list on Zoom? I would say about a dozen. That's my estimate. I'm not sure. It's very, very hard to guess. Well, is it Richard Nichols? I wonder.
Van Emmerich.
Oh, Van Emmerich. Yeah, okay. Because Nichols also wanted to join at least some of the talks, but he wasn't sure when he would be able.
Today is a regular day, so I think that not so many people can. They are available 2 hours during the week.
Well, in many countries, everything is on quarantine, so people are sitting at home anyway.
Yeah.
Richard Nichols.
Hi there.
Hi.
Hello.
Morning, everybody.
Schoner, hi.
Hello. Hi, Marco.
How's it going?
Hello, Gregor. We cannot see you. But we
I'm turning on my camera.
Hi.
Yeah, hi.
Possibly.
Gregor, I think that today the internet connection is much better because today I'm at my office, so I think that we have the streaming will be much better, the quality of the presentation, people will be able to see. They were able to read my tables.
Well, we are sure that the quality of presentation will be much better because it's Mindy.
And Luis, you will be able to.
I have a good mentor.
Luis, you will be able to increase the screen resolution then?
Yes.
Okay. So I was wondering if one might want to not show these Zoom chat dialogues even so, and just use the YouTube.
Well, Luis mentioned that his preference would be that he and his friends filter out the YouTube chat, and then they only forward questions that they think are meaningful and worth mentioning. They forward them to me, and then those that I can answer in real time, like in a knee-jerk fashion, I will. Those that I cannot will stay and wait for Mindy.
But where will you answer them? In the
Zoom chat? Yes.
The problem with the Zoom chat is that the Zoom chat just flows on the YouTube screen. They can't scroll, so they often actually even don't see the original question by the time you're able to answer.
But I think, Luis, you can record the Zoom, right? You could record it.
Yeah. Well, can the one who can record is Mark.
Mark, there's a button on the top left of the screen where you can press the record button.
But that doesn't really help. The students still can't scroll.
No, the question is whether they can get answers to their questions.
No, but then we can record it. No, we won't be able to do it in real time, but we can record it.
That's the point.
And we can post the answers, as Luis was mentioning before.
But posting the answers makes sense from the speaker. Like posting my knee-jerk reactions, it doesn't make very much sense. This is just...
I mean, I think if you have a good answer, then you could, just copy the answer into the Ustream YouTube chat, and people then react to that. I find the students are quite tuned to that. They are more into typing than asking questions in general.
Yeah.
And so,
but, Mark, I think it's a good idea still to record.
Well, let me see. I'm sorry. Let me see if I can connect. Now, Luis, are you already on?
Yeah, it's already there.
YouTube?
Yes.
Okay, live now. So I can connect. Now, Luis, are you already on? Okay.
See, that's when we have the echo. It's when you have both screens open.
Live now. So I can connect. Luis,
because there's a delay.
What's going on, guys?
You have to turn off the sound in YouTube. In YouTube, you have to turn off the sound. In the YouTube window, you have a little sound button at the bottom, and just turn that off.
It's like talking to someone in Mars. You have a delay.
There's a delay.
And 10 minutes
so you don't want to listen to the YouTube video, because that would then go through a circle. But you can see it live, and you can type if you.
Mark, you're muted. You muted your Zoom. Unmute the Zoom so we can hear you. But Mark, I suggest.
I'm muted. I muted myself. All right. So I just muted myself everywhere just in case.
Can you make me presenter so I can record it?
Sure, you're the presenter.
No. You have to give me permission. You have to go to the present.
How do I do that?
I don't know. I don't have the your screen. Somewhere one of the connections there.
In Zoom, how do I make you presenter? I don't know.
I think at the bottom you might have.
There might be some,
a button at the bottom.
Yeah.
There are preferences. Well, button on the bottom. Participants.
I think. I think actually,
if I can,
Mindy, you can, if you go to participants, if you click on participants, then you can do claim host.
Yes. Yeah. No, he's not the host.
Oh gosh! Enter the host key to claim host role. Now, what's that? Host key is a 6-10-digit number, or log in to claim host. I have no idea what.
No, there must be another button, but it's similar. It's in the one that there's a lock there that I can't access, but you can. It has the characteristics.
Hi.
The lock is just the encryption.
Where are we?
Oh, John. I don't know what you mean.
In the top left corner, there is an info sign, and there if you click on that gives you the meeting ID, and that meeting ID can be entered when you claim host. So Mindy can claim host, and then she needs that.
Let me. Okay, interesting. So Mindy, let me try to claim.
I think it's Mindy who has to claim host. Right?
I have to do that?
Yeah.
But I don't see how to do. There's no option.
So if you go to participants, at the bottom right you have claim host. If you click that, then it will ask you for something. Bottom right, it's not.
I see claim host. You're right. You got it. Okay. So the host key is that number on the top, 554.
5549 450 750.
Or Mark has a special host key.
That's what it tells me. I don't
Did
know.
it allow that to happen?
It's not letting me.
No. Mark, do you have some other number that you can give her?
Not that I'm aware of. I'm happily looking on my screen and seeing nothing else. There is my participant ID, but I don't think that should work. That should be relevant. Meeting ID, yes. But since it was not password protected, this meeting, it's open, then I don't think I have anything.
I guess security will be there, so we should start, probably.
Just a second.
Okay. All right.
I'm not ready. Let me just see if I can do this. Give me 1 second. I'm going to try to put the number in.
We are already on time.
Okay. People. Yeah, let me see. I've got to be able to put this host number in. 9450715. Okay. Claim host. No, it's not the host key.
No, so it's another number that
It's another number.
Mark
I guess Mark
may
has.
have from Zoom, but I don't know where it is. It's maybe not in the app, so it's maybe
All right. Anyway,
some email that he has from Zoom.
can you try to record it, please? There's a way that you can just press a red button somewhere and record it.
I don't know because never done that.
I can copy. I can Control C and Control V the chat, so I can solve it. No problem.
You can solve it.
Yes.
Okay.
All right.
You can record the talk to put on
Mindy,
the.
why don't we get ready for your talk? And when you're ready, say ready.
I'm ready.
Okay. Then everybody else, we should mute ourselves. Well, except me for a second because I'm going to introduce Mindy, and then there we go. So, Luis, are we already in real time?
Yes, we are.
We are. Fantastic. Okay, so welcome everybody for this second edition of the virtual Motor Control School. Let's hope that it works better than the previous one, and we have fewer technical glitches. It's great to introduce our speaker, Mindy Levin. Mindy has been a leading figure in the field of rehabilitation, motor control, motor disorders, you name it, and of course, equilibrium point hypothesis. She learned it from Anatole and became a champion of this approach and an educator for the world, particularly among clinicians, among people who deal with patients. So I'm sure that Mindy will put together motor control, motor rehabilitation, and equilibrium point hypothesis, or at least one of its versions today. Mindy, great. It's all yours. I'm shutting down myself.
Okay, good. That's a very nice thing. I'd like to shut down yourself. Okay, share screen. There we go. Share. Okay. Okay, can everybody see my slides? Yeah? Okay.
Yes.
So, thank you. This is certainly an interesting and challenging way of interacting at the Motor Control Summer School, although I would rather be on the beach in Slovenia. But anyway, there we are. So I'm going to talk about normal and disordered motor control. Of course, my background is rehab, but my interest is translating notions about motor control into rehabilitation interventions to improve rehabilitation. And today in particular, I'm going to talk about motor equivalence and adaptability, and specifically about reaching tasks in people, primarily people with stroke. The objectives today are to become familiar with some of the motor control principles, and these are of redundancy, motor equivalence, and threshold control, and how they can be used to understand deficits in movement production in people with neurological injuries, and then some of the implications for rehabilitation. It's not entirely comprehensive to do, but we'll be trying to focus on specific points. So I don't know how this is working for questions, Luis, but if there's a question, or Mark, there's a question that I should address, you will interrupt me? Is that how it's going to work?
I think we are all going to interrupt you when we have our personal questions, but
of course, yeah.
If there are written questions from the audience, Luis and his friends will select them, will do some primary selection, and some of them will go to me and I will try to answer them in real time. And others we will collect and we will present to you at the end of your talk.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to start with some background on what we think about and what we imagine is motor recovery in rehabilitation. So, of course, motor recovery is based on our assumptions. I'm sorry, I've got some... Sorry. No, it's a little break. Just a second. I'll be back in a second. You can talk. Hi, guys.
Anatole, you can meanwhile continue the talk.
Mindy, I can only read my broken English. The next slide, but let's wait for her. Okay.
Hey, you have to get out of my chair, though.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm not used to talking sitting down. Sorry. So, where was I? So, how we think about recovery, it's based on our assumptions about what we think is normal movement. And we know, I mean, therapists tend to concentrate, or rehab concentrates on trying to improve the range of motion of a single joint or the force of a single joint, to what we call maximizing strength or maximizing some kind of local kind of coordination. But I think what's missing in rehab is a broader view of what is normal motor control and how we can integrate concepts of motor control into rehab. So one of the main points, or one of the main principles of motor control, is that the system has kinematic redundancy. It has redundancy at many levels, but I'm going to focus on kinematic redundancy, which was originally specified or discussed by Bernstein. And then the redundancy also should be considered with respect to the phenomenon of motor equivalence, which was introduced by Lashley in 1951. So because of redundancy and equivalence and motor equivalence, there are many ways that a normal movement can be performed, and all of these movements can represent acceptable solutions to a motor task. So the idea that there is no ideal or perfect way of doing something, and that, there may be some kind of efficiency that you're trying to get to, but in terms of the kinematic pathway that we're trying to reach, or the way the muscles are contracting together, there's no one specific way. That there's a group of, or a family of different ways. In rehab, what we tend to do, and I think most of us do anyway when we're describing behavior, is we break it down into end effector movement and movement of individual joints, which I like to talk about as at different levels: performance level and movement quality level. But what we need to do is identify the underlying deficits in movement production in patients, and then we need to measure whether rehab interventions restore these movement patterns back to what we consider normal. And that's the big question. So what is normal, and how do we define normal? So I'm going to go over a little bit the principle of motor equivalence according to Lashley. He talked about distributed control. Lashley was an American psychologist who lived in the first part of the 20th century. He accepted at the time there was a big debate about localization and distributed control in terms of what parts of the brain control what areas, or are there specific structure-function relationships, or is it more distributed? There was general agreement, and even Bernstein agreed with that there's specialized areas of sensory and motor areas that are specialized specific functions, but associative functions occur at a higher level. And Bernstein actually listed 5 different hierarchical levels of control, each level representing a higher level of abstraction. Actually, these are the subject of a book that Mark Batas just finished translating. I don't know if it's published yet, Mark, or available, but where Bernstein...
It's not published, but it is currently in production by Routledge. So
Great.
It's supposed to get out during this year.
Okay, so just if you want to get into this headspace of how people were thinking in those days, and you read this book by Bernstein, which is extremely, extremely verbose. Yeah, but it does give you an idea of how he came to the idea of different hierarchical levels of control. Anyway, Lashley had talked about distributed control because he did some experiments where he had taught an animal a certain behavior, and then he removed a large portion of the relevant brain tissue, and when he did that, the learned behavior remained. So he thought that this learned behavior had to be stored somewhere else, but not just in the specific motor area to which it had been attributed. So there was a level, or the notion of higher level integrations, and the concept that the function is the function or the production of movement is due to a dynamical organization or reorganization or constantly changing organization of the entire cerebral system. There's two laws or principles that sort of came from this thinking. One is the idea of equipotentiality, and the other the idea of mass action. Equipotentiality is the capacity for any area or intact brain area to carry out the functions lost by the destruction of the whole. That is actually now being where it has received some support from brain-computer interface interventions that show that you can get people to learn to move using an array of electrodes placed in different parts of the brain, not necessarily over the purported area that's supposed to be controlling that specific function. And also then the concept of mass action, which is the efficiency of performance of an entire complex function, that it may be reduced in proportion to the extent of the brain injury, so that there is still some relevant or critical mass that's necessary in order for the action to be properly performed. This is related to the concept of redundancy, coined by Bernstein and later changed and retranslated by Mark to be known as the concept of abundance, which I'm going to get into a little bit later. So Lashley, interestingly, in 1938, specified some implications for rehabilitation of these concepts of equipotentiality and motor equivalence. And he said that the fundamental and important effects of cerebral injury are not the simple sensory motor disorders, but they're the deficits in the capacity for organization. So this is so that the system has a lowered level of abstraction, and it's in the construction of the movements where the problem is occurring, and not in the actual performance of the movements themselves. So how are movements constructed? Based on the principle of redundancy, we have to consider redundancy as part of that idea of construction. So the principle of redundancy, as one definition here, is the organization of the movement, number of degrees of freedom, timing, and interjoint coordination that's related to the task. So here's just an example for a simple reaching task. So here the goal is to move the hand from point A to point B. So the position A has 3 coordinates in space, X, Y, Z, and you have to move it at a particular time to point B, which has a different set of coordinates. So if you want to plan this movement, you have to find the combination of joint rotations that will bring the hand from A to B. It's a problem of inverse dynamics, and there's an excessive number of degrees of freedom that are being used to perform this task. So let's say, assuming that there's 7 degrees of freedom of the arm, and there's actually more, but if we're just looking at the shoulder, elbow, and wrist, there's 7. So the system needs to find a 7-dimensional vector describing the arm configuration at position B, which is a 3-dimensional space. So there's a large number of unknowns. I don't do modeling myself, but I know that this is a huge problem already that has to be solved, and there's no general solution. So what you have to do is constrain the task and then try to minimize the number of parameters in order to get to a solution. So let's say we assume that you solve that problem, then you also have to know the joint torques and not only the joint torques, but also the time functions. So it becomes a much more complex problem. So does the system actually compute these movements from one position to another? Or does the movement emerge from a higher type of higher order kind of coordination? This is just another way of looking at the problem where this is a picture from a book also translated by Mark, I think with Mike Turvey, from Bernstein called Dexterity and Its Development, where Bernstein talked about sawing action, where the sawing action is the stable output of the system. The saw is going in the same direction, at the same speed, with the same force, but the number of degrees of freedom of the body that are related or interacting with the saw changes, and still you can have a consistent outcome. So the degrees of freedom problem was specified or described by Bernstein. It's in his 1967 book and also in his other publications. And he said that every time we move, we have a unique solution. So the system doesn't plan a specific or ideal solution, but it sort of lets the solution find itself based on the parameters or the desired action and the interaction with the environment. So for reaching the nose, for example, you can have the same solution with a number of different combinations of joint rotations, and this is actually the beauty of the system. And it's not a problem of redundancy, but it is actually the joy of abundance, because it allows the system to find many different ways of doing something, and also to adapt when external conditions change. So this is an example of how redundancy allows us to adapt to something. So here we repeated the experiment that Bernstein did. You can see the pictures on the top right are cyclograms that were taken by Bernstein of a hammering task. And we repeated this experiment with Julie Cote, and we did actual hammering an actual nail into an actual piece of wood. And what you see here are the hammer trajectories for each successive hammer strike. You can see on the bottom that the orientation of the hammer strike is in the direction of the nail, which would be here. So the direction is always the same, in spite of the fact that there can be a lot of hysteresis and change in the shape of the trajectory of the hammer. What this shows is that the gray...
Mindy, I think it's time to start interrupting you. And just look at the scale of your anterior-posterior direction, and it looks that either the subject was missing the nail 9 times out of 10, or the nail was extremely huge.
Probably the nail had a large head on it. What do you got, millimeters there? It's about 20 millimeters. It's pretty big. Yeah, we weren't looking for extreme precision. Orientation is the same, but the precision is not exactly the same. Okay.
Yes,
okay.
Of course.
Yeah. Okay. I can't see you. This is strange to speak to a black abyss. Okay. So the gray trajectories are pre-fatigue, and the black trajectories are post-fatigue of the shoulder muscles. So the orientation of the hammer strikes doesn't change, even though the trajectory of the hammer changes, meaning that there was a different interjoint coordination as well during the hammering. So we can change our interjoint coordination and still maintain the desired action, which is how we use redundancy or abundance to adapt to external conditions. Another example of redundancy is from David Ostrey's lab. This is an old paper already, but I think it nicely illustrates that you can have, these are different combinations of two joints. So the pitch angle of the jaw on the y-axis and the horizontal position of the jaw on the x-axis. And these are different speech utterances. So this is a person saying so, or see, or some other sound, see, re, li, and t. And you can see that each sound has not a specific coordination between the two joints, but a whole family of them that all go in the same direction, but they have a certain variability. So just an example that even in a simple two-joint system, you can have a lot of variability that leads to the same outcome, in this case, an auditory sound. So the problem of redundancy, just to summarize it. So how does the CNS select a particular solution from an infinite number of possibilities? So how do we know, how does the system know which is the best one? So we can go, there's two basic approaches to understanding or addressing this question. One approach is based on physical models, where the idea is that we have an abundant system, so we always use all the available degrees of freedom to generate families of solutions. And in this way, the system can always adapt and use optimally the degrees of freedom it needs. Then there's the biomechanical approach, or a more reductionist one, where there may be certain representations or patterns that are recalled in order to optimize the movement, so that you have a unique solution that is optimal for energy consumption or some other variable. And this approach actually tries to eliminate redundant degrees of freedom. So one approach considers degrees of freedom as redundant, whereas the other approach, the physical approach, considers them as being abundant. We're still a lot of debate about these hypotheses. Anatole spoke on Saturday about the physical model, and I guess Mark will pick up that again. And I'm going to argue that in rehab, we should be looking for abundant solutions in order to give our patients more flexibility, because what happens after a stroke is that they lose their abundance, they lose their ability to find new solutions, and that leads to a lot of movement disorders. So I'm going to switch now to give you some examples and show you some movements in patients with stroke. Starting with simple reaching tasks. This is just a top-down view of reaching task to a target in the midline on the top, and a target in ipsilateral space on the bottom. So the hand, it's a top-down view. So this is the left shoulder, right shoulder. You see my mark? Yeah, and the sternum is here. The three arm positions are, the dotted line is the initial position, the dashed line is the position at peak velocity, and the solid line is the position at the end of the movement, final position. Fingers are shown by little dots. So the task is to reach to the target in the midline, and you can see the healthy subject does this with a nice movement of the horizontal movement of the arm joints. But for both of the movements, for the midline and for the ipsilateral target. But if you look at the mild patient with stroke, you can see already that there's, even the mild patient, there's some rotation in the trunk. This is excessive. This is unnecessary, considering if you compare the behavior to the mild patient to the healthy control. And it means that the patient is using this trunk movement to compensate for something that is not occurring in the arm joints. Compensation becomes even more marked in people with moderate stroke and severe stroke, may not be able to do this task at all. this moderately affected patient. You can see the initial position is here, and then the final position is essentially the same as the initial position, except that the trunk is translated forward, and all of the movement is accomplished by the movement of the trunk.
Mindy, may I ask a question?
Yes,
right
yes,
here?
sure.
I'm not sure you might be coming to that in a moment. For me, these kinds of arguments always raise the point that was originally my motivation to study the uncontrolled manifold, in that you have to make a judgment if the degree to which these patients fail on the task, if that is less or more than the adaptation they do in the abundance space, right? You see some change, but is that change preserving something? Are you going to analyze that? Is that where you're going, or is it enough for you to characterize it this way?
I'm not sure that I understand. Are you sure? Are you saying that this is an acceptable solution to move the trunk?
I'm essentially saying that even though it's intuitive that moving the trunk, for instance, is now a form of compensation, a priori, what you see is the movement has changed. It's different movement, and I think the language you're using suggests that there is change, and that change is to reinstate the function, which would be maybe to get the hand to the target.
Yeah,
but
this is
in order to establish that, you would have to be able to compare how much movement there is of, how much remaining deviation there is for the hand in space compared to all the other degrees of freedom.
I agree.
Which is what we do with this uncontrolled manifold technique, but I'm not aware that you do that with the patients, right?
Yeah.
Well, let me maybe give my 5 cents, which is that I think, Gregor, what Mindy is illustrating us is a change in the sharing pattern among the variables. So a change in the center of the distribution, if you consider the high-dimensional kinematic space. So the preferred center of the distribution shifts. Now, whether then variability is organized in such a way that it's primarily within the uncontrolled manifold or not is another question. And I don't think it's illustrated in this picture. This picture shows that the sharing is changed.
But this is a very important point, Gregor, and in the rehab community, this is a very big debate. So the point is, if you speak to, certainly it comes up, if the patient is able to effectively do the action using a different combination of joint rotations, that's absolutely fine. Okay? And in the rehab world, we say that we're teaching the patient to compensate or to adapt. Okay? However, the other side of the coin is that if you let a person use compensations, which we call this trunk movement a compensation, repeatedly, then they learn the bad pattern, so-called bad pattern, okay, or the alternative pattern, and it replaces the potential for learning the new pattern, or the recovering the old pattern. In other words, and Teresa Jones has shown this in the animal model, that the compensation is due to bad plasticity, and can be, the more you do a bad movement, the more you will keep that the pattern of the movement in the brain, and you can't get rid of it, and then it becomes harder to break it up. And so what therapists have to do is that they have to identify those patients who have the potential to return their function to what's called normal, and stop them from compensating, because the system will compensate. The system will always find the easiest way to do something. Okay? We're all like that. We're all very lazy, right? But the therapist has to identify that laziness. Is it laziness, or is it just lack of capacity? So to what extent does the person, this is the big question in rehab, to what extent does the person have the capacity to recover, truly recover movement patterns that they had before the lesion? And if they do have that capacity, then we should not let them compensate. Because once the system compensates, because of plasticity, the system will just learn to use the bad pattern, and it's very hard to unlearn that bad pattern.
This is Richard, Mindy. So the question there, though, is what do we mean with a bad pattern, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So it could be something that maybe has other consequences in terms of degenerative aspects, and I agree with that. But we can't simply just say bad pattern. In this case, it could be completely functional, not result in any other kind of bad adaptations or bad consequences. So I wouldn't call it a bad pattern based on that, right?
Yeah, that's another another area of debate, Richard, and it's not so simple to answer. So if somebody is walking after a stroke and not abducting the hip and flexing the hip, and they're doing hip hiking instead, okay, that's a bad. Let's say that's a compensation, and the hip hiking using the lat dorsi and the other muscles of the back to raise the hip up in order to take a step is stopping, let's say, taking over for the potential function of the hip flexor. So you're not focusing on strengthening the hip flexor or getting the hip flexor to work in the pattern, and you're just letting the hip hike to continue. So that would be a bad pattern because it may be stopping the system from potentially recovering the pattern that it could have that would improve the gait cycle, number one. And two, it can lead to back pain from a lot excessive hip hiking. So so it's always a debate about what is you're talking about, in terms of the compensations.
Good.
Yeah, but certainly it's an important debate. And for reaching, using the trunk for me is not such is say problematic again. Not because of what might that the person would. It's only a problem because if the person has the potential for improving the coordination between elbow extension and shoulder adduction, but they don't act on it because they're using their trunk all the time, then they're going to lose eventually that potential to recover that movement. It becomes learned non-use or learned disuse. And this has been shown over and over again now by Teresa Jones and her group.
May I follow up on that? Someone on YouTube was asking how you can actually observe the recovery of function. And I wonder, would that be for you then the recovery of the same configuration? That is, you actually want to say, so motor equivalent solutions are not recovery, or are you really talking about recovery of the function in terms of achieving the?
So this comes down to a question of measurement. So clinically, the majority of our clinical tests measure whether a person can accomplish the task. So they're about task completion. Can the person lift up the cup? It doesn't say how. So the problem is that most of our functional testing is at the functional level and not at the movement quality level. So we do now have, I created what we call the Reaching Performance Scale for Stroke, which is a measure of compensations used in reaching. So we can actually quantify them based on observational kinematics that clinicians can use. But a lot of the other tasks do not have ways of measuring compensation, but I think people are working on that. So we have to look at both the end effector or the task completion level, which is the functional level, but also the quality of the movement during the function. So it's a matter of clinical measurement. Okay, can I go on? Okay, go on. So we were talking about...
I'll just ask a question, Mindy. It's Richard Nichols. So in this case, the patient has lost a degree of abundance, right? Just to put it back in the terms that you had talked about before.
Yes.
Well, I'm sorry, I wouldn't say that, because the number of degrees of freedom has not changed in that patient. Simply ability to use quantitatively the range of motion is diminished. So the people, and then they decide or they prefer to use a specific new sharing pattern. We should distinguish between these two things. Sharing patterns is how you share the task among possible contributing elements. And then there is a normal one, which is shown here in the healthy person for a given task. How much would you move different joints? And then there is an unusual one, which is shown in this moderate stroke picture. Now, of course, one has to interpret it, why they would do that and what it means. But I wouldn't say that the amount of abundance changed in the system, because, I mean, there is no orthopedic problem or no paralysis of some muscles that doesn't allow to move individual joints.
Actually, I think there's a combination of both. There is some loss of abundance or loss of degree. Some joints don't move at all. Okay, you can have complete shoulder flaccidity. Okay. And other joints move less. And I'm going to get to that, I hope, if I get to the end, where there's zones in which the movements are possible and movements are not possible. So in that case, there's not a lack of abundance. There's a diminished possibility of combinations, number of combinations. Okay.
Well, thank you for clarifying that, because I had never thought of abundance as being strictly referring to the musculoskeletal system itself. I had included the entire system, including the central nervous system, but you're saying that abundance is defined as strictly on mechanical terms, essentially.
Kinematic abundance.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, move on. Slide 18, 16. Okay, so the pictures I showed you before of the trunk contributing to the endpoint movement, maybe this will clarify some of the points we already were just talking about. On the left, you can see a control, but this is top down again. These are movements of the hand. This is the endpoint position of the hand, moving from the center, the initial position to the center, or the contralateral target, or the ipsilateral target. Just ignore the two different colors. One is for virtual environments. It's for another talk. But I wanted just to show you that there's a family of curves, even in the control subject, a certain variability, and that's regarded to be normal for the task. And here you can see the trunk is not moving at all for this task. And but you can see that the trunk is moving for this individual here who has a mild stroke, and quite a bit for this person in the stroke who has a severe stroke. Yet, if you didn't look at the trunk movement and just looked at the endpoint trajectories, you'd say they look pretty much normal. So the person, that's getting back to our debate from before, that you can produce the same endpoint movement or functionally, but through a different combination of degrees of freedom. So we looked at how the trunk is actually used or integrated into reaching. And this is an old study, but it illustrates well what I mean. We had people had to reach to targets placed at 4 different distances. The first target was very close to the body, about half the arm length. The second target was at the arm length. Third one was beyond the arm length. And the fourth one actually required the person to stand up and lean forward. It was 2 times, or 1.5 times arm length. And here we plot the movement of the endpoint that was related to displacement of the arm versus displacement of the trunk in the Y direction. So you can see that for the first and second targets in the healthy subject, the endpoint position was entirely due to movements of the arm, as expected, because it's within arm length. But to get to the beyond arm length target, the trunk had to start contributing a little bit. And you can see that the trunk the red line shows that the trunk contribution to the movement is actually starting right at the beginning and having a kind of consistent contribution and then a little bit more at the end. This is also true for the target at T4. So the far target, the trunk is contributing right from the beginning and contributes a lot more at the end. And that's in a healthy subject. So if we look at the slope of the target, the far target, we see that the trunk, like I said, starts to move right from the beginning of the reach and contributes throughout the reach. If we look at what happens now in the mild stroke subject, moderate and severe. Mild stroke subject looks very much like the healthy subject. The moderate patient, though, shows there's a sloping pattern right from the beginning for all of the targets. And if we take the exact same slope and translate it below, we see that reaching to the close target involved displacement of the trunk in the same pattern as we saw for reaching the target place beyond the reach in the healthy subject. This means that for the close target, the person was recruiting the trunk right from the beginning, as if the target was located far from the body. That's just the spatial question or the spatial description. But now I'm going to switch a little bit to the temporal consideration. So normally when we make movements that involve the trunk starts to move before the arm starts to move, as if so the trunk is already involved. The trunk being a larger mass has to be accelerated earlier in order to then be coordinated with the movement of the arm, which has a lower mass. So the trunk starts to move first. That's what you see here on the bottom part of this slide, healthy subject. So in the order of less than 200 milliseconds, the trunk starts to move. And then prior to the hand movement, simultaneously, this line in the middle is the hand movement. So trunk starts to move before the hand movement, and actually the trunk stops moving after the hand movement at the end of the reach, which is probably because the trunk has larger mass and takes longer to decelerate it. So it just continues on for a little bit before the hand stops moving, after the hand stops moving. So this pattern of integration of trunk movement temporally in this way, where the trunk begins to move before the arm and continues to move after the arm has stopped, is actually preserved in patients with stroke. And when they're using their trunk for a trunk-assisted reach. So we thought that this problem that we observed in patients where they are using spatially more, the trunk is contributing to the arm movement, is that if there's a critical arm distance at which the trunk, if an object is placed before this critical arm distance, then the person will perceive that the object is located within arm reach and can just use arm joint rotations to reach that object. But at a certain point, which is about 90% of the arm's length, if the object is located here or after, then the system will know that it has to incorporate another degree of freedom, an additional degree of freedom, the trunk, in order to reach the target. And this is a trunk-assisted reach. And when it knows that, then the trunk is recruited right from the beginning in order to coordinate the movements of the two elements. In stroke, we think that because we observe this pattern of recruitment of the trunk, even for targets that are located within arm length distance, we think that the problem of reaching in the patients is not simply a problem of how far they can reach their arm, but it's a question of where they perceive the object. Maybe it's a question of perception. So the patients are perceiving this, maybe they're perceiving this target at a beyond arm length position. They can't reach it just with their arm length, with their arm joint rotations, even when it's closer to the body. So, and we know that because we did other experiments where we blocked the trunk And we did what was called a forced use paradigm. We forced the person to reach targets that they normally would have used their trunk for reaching. And they didn't. They could actually, if you forced them to, they could actually reach their arm far out to reach this task. So it wasn't that they couldn't reach this target, but they preferred to use their trunk and when they did use their trunk, they used it in a pattern that was consistent with a beyond the arm length reach. So maybe what we have to do with the patients is not simply re-educating or forcing them to use the arm joints, but maybe change their perception of what is possible. And that's something we call self-efficacy, and the potential or the possibility of a person, or they have the confidence in order to do a specific task. So that's another aspect that, of course, in rehab we are very much involved in trying to encourage. So the message until now are that patients with chronic stroke or hemiparesis use excessive trunk movement even for reaches to close targets. I didn't show you all this data, but the references are there if you want to see the data. So they use the trunk for assisting the hand transport during reaching. They also use the trunk to assist orienting the hand for grasping and to assist arm swinging and standing and during walking. So we think that articular redundancy is decreased in patients with stroke. And again, we can get into this debate as to whether it's just the actual number of degrees of freedom is reduced. In some cases, yes. But also that they have a reduced range of active control. And the other thing is that for simple reaching, when the trunk is involved, it's recruited as an integral part of the reaching movement. Okay, so can't see anybody if they're feeling tired or need a break, but I can continue. Need a break? No break? Okay. So the question is then, does limited abundance affect motor adaptability in patients with stroke? Because of course movement and action and life is all about adaptability. So I'm going to bring you through a series of tasks where we looked we looked at motor equivalence, or the ability of people to perform the same task using a different combination of joint rotations. This is a task of trunk-assisted reaching from sitting. The person was sitting with a harness with an electromagnet attached to the back, and when the back was in contact with the chair back, the electromagnet was on and it locked the person's trunk to the chair back. The reaching is done without vision. They wore opaque glasses, and the task was to bend the trunk forward in the sagittal direction while reaching to the right, or to the ipsilateral workspace, it could have been left arm too, at the same time. So trunk sagittal, arm lateral. And then on random trials, we locked the trunk at the beginning of the reach. It's a soundless lock. The person didn't know the trunk was going to be released or not. But in some trials, the trunk was locked and the person had to do the same reach. And we looked at how they accomplished that. So the healthy subject is shown here on the bottom. You can see that the trunk, the yellow trace is the movement of the trunk forward when the trunk was free. You can see that the electromagnet essentially locked the trunk. The person, you can see the black diminished, the decreased range of motion due to the trunk locking. And here is the arm trajectory. The red one is when the trunk was free, and the blue one when the trunk was blocked. So there's an absolute correspondence of the trunk free and trunk blocked arm trajectory. They're laying right on top of the other. Of course, there's some deviation of the blue one from the red line when the arm reaches the full extent of extension, because they can't use their trunk, so the arm starts veering off to the right. But up until that point, there's complete correspondence. The patient with stroke, this person has a very mild stroke, according to the Fuglemeyer score, which measures the upper limb impairment. So it's level 60 out of 66, which is very mild. And you can see that there was some correspondence, but also some early deviation of the two trajectories. The patient with a more severe stroke, 50 out of 66, showed even earlier deviation. So they couldn't maintain the invariance of the hand trajectory. So why is it? What happened? So first of all, let's describe a little bit what this task is. It looks very simple, but it really involves a very fine coordination. So Ma and Feldman described this coordination as the superposition of two synergies. The first synergy, shown here at the top, is the arm transport synergy, whereby the hand moves from position A to position B just by rotation of the arm, elbow, shoulder joints. In this case, elbow extension, shoulder horizontal abduction, adduction. But the second synergy is shown here on the bottom, and that is a compensatory synergy. I'm using this word now in a motor control sense and not in a pathological sense. So a compensatory synergy whereby the arm starts to rotate back towards the initial position as the trunk is moving forward to compensate for the forward trunk displacement. These two synergies are superimposed on each other in order to stabilize the endpoint trajectory. It's a very fine coordination and something that involves critical timing and critical movement between the arm and trunk joints. So what's happening, though, in the patients and in the healthy subjects in terms of their interjoint coordination to perform this fine coordination? Here's another picture of the same task in the healthy subject, where there's the coincidence of the trajectories up to a certain point, which is the majority of the trajectory length. So how does the healthy subject do this? Is that they change their shoulder-elbow interjoint coordination pattern. So the dotted line here on the right in the healthy subject shows the interjoint coordination pattern used when the trunk was free to move. And the dashed line, or the solid line, shows the interjoint coordination that the person used when the trunk was blocked. They're completely different. So in order to maintain the endpoint trajectory, the system had to change the coordination, change the interjoint coordination or the structure of the movement. This is simple, I know, for people who do UCM and look at multiple degrees of freedom. We're just looking at two, but the example is illustrative, and I'm sure there's compensations, but the task is also only planar, so we're really capturing the majority, the more important degrees of freedom here. But the point here is that the stroke patient who had trouble maintaining the same trajectory, part of this trouble, or the main problem, is that they could not, or they didn't, change their interjoint coordination. So here they're showing a fixed interjoint coordination between the shoulder and the elbow that they're repeating for both of these tasks. And of course, if you don't change the interjoint coordination, then you're going to have a deviation of the endpoint trajectory, and that's what happened here. So there's the patients use excessive degrees of freedom, and they also have a limited number of synergies, and they also have a limited number or ability to adapt the synergies. So this is one of the underlying mechanisms or underlying problems that we might be able to address in rehab. Here's another example of motor equivalence issue that we studied. This is from Yusuke Tomita, who is now a professor in Japan, and I hope he's with us today. This is motor equivalence during reaching from standing. Also a perturbation paradigm. Here's the initial position on the left. Person is standing, and the task is to reach an object that's 130% of the arm length distance away. But there we have this, we call the buttock perturbation experiment, because there's an electromagnet attached to a pulley that's attached to that's pressing or can press against the person's rear end. Now, when you lean forward to touch this object that's placed at a distance away, you have to move your hips back, which is shown here by the red outline. So when the hips go back, we allowed, for the free hip condition, we allowed this electromagnet to swing freely, so it was actually pressed against the wall and it didn't interfere with the reaching. Now here in the blocked hip condition, when we locked this magnet and the person had leaned the buttocks backwards to do this task, it actually ended up perturbing the person and caused them actually to take a step, because it blocked the ability of the buttocks to go backwards. So that was called the blocked hip condition, and then we compared that to initial and intentional step condition to see if there's a difference in how the task was organized when the blocked hip condition forced the step as a reaction versus when you intended to take a step from the beginning. So this was done with eyes closed, as in all of these tasks, so that the person doesn't have a chance to voluntarily or consciously make movement corrections. We want to see the behavior that was intended and not the behavior that is the reaction to the behavior. So there was blocks of 60 trials, and we did the perturbation in randomly selected trials, 30% of them, and we measured the upper limb, lower limb, and we measured the gain. The gain is the change in the position of the anterior posterior position of the endpoint compared to over the change of the hip. So the forward displacement of the hip and the backward displacement of the hand had to be equal in order to have a gain of 1. Here's an example of the reaching task in the healthy subject on the left. So the red trajectory that was there was the free trunk trajectory. The trajectory that was done without the blocking. And then the perturbed one that is blue is what we're seeing here. When the person bends forward, the hips go back, the magnet pushes the hips forward, and the person actually takes a step. But you can see from this example that the endpoint trajectory was preserved, regardless of the fact that all the degrees of freedom in the entire body actually changed throughout this task. The endpoint velocity is shown here. This was also preserved. And how this was accomplished, how the endpoint trajectory was preserved, was because of a change in the interjoint coordination. Now again, only 3 degrees of freedom in this multi-degree of freedom system, but we looked at the hip, the elbow, and the shoulder, the ones contributing to the most to this task. We see that for the free trunk condition, the coordination is shown by the red line, but the 3-joint coordination changes by the blue line when the trunk is perturbed in order to preserve the endpoint trajectory. In the patient with stroke, here's the example, same thing. The red is the trajectory of the free movement, and the blue is the trajectory of the perturbed movement. There was a problem maintaining the end of, or controlling the end of the movement. There were a number of corrections made throughout the movement. And if you see the endpoint, the interjoint coordination, though, is not changing. It's the same. So it's as if the pattern of movement is fixed in this person. They have a kind of limited ability to adapt, and that leads to errors in the endpoint movement. So just to reiterate, the healthy subject preserved the endpoint trajectory despite the changes in trunk and leg displacement. This is the endpoint trajectory for all 3 conditions, free, blocked, and intentional step. And you can see they're pretty much overlying each other, even though the trunk movement changes very much, and so does the foot displacement. And the gains in the group of patients was around 0.71. Whereas the stroke patients ended up deviating in the displacement. There was always an overshoot level error in most of them. And you can see that the gains were lower. For the mild stroke group, it was 0.61, and the moderate stroke group, 0.33. So people with moderate stroke did not do well at all in this task. Those with mild stroke considered to be well-recovered patients also didn't do as well as healthy subjects. This is just some new work that we've just in the process of publishing, looking at motor equivalence for not just exocentric reaching, but also egocentric reaching. This is what you see here is similar to the first study I showed you where we did trunk-assisted reaching, except that this is within the reaching, with and without trunk displacement, again, without vision. So here the person has to reach from an initial to a final target, and in some trials the trunk is blocked, and so they have to change. They still have the external targets haven't changed, so they have to change something in order to maintain the endpoint trajectory. So you see the healthy subject does maintain the trunk free and trunk blocked. Trunk free is blue, trunk blocked is red, so the endpoint trajectory is maintained. The stroke patient had a little more difficulty, actually deviated right from the beginning. But how this endpoint trajectory was maintained was done through a change, an immediate change in the coordination between shoulder abduction and elbow extension, and also between shoulder flexion and elbow extension. Whereas the patient, this patient, didn't change the interjoint coordination for the target. And this is reflected in the responses of the whole group, where the healthy subjects are shown by black and the stroke subjects shown by white. The black is, so this is the trajectory divergence. So if it's trajectory divergence occurred late in the healthy group, but early in the stroke group. And the trajectory divergence, the lateness was due to early divergence in the interjoint coordination patterns for the two joints that we looked at, and later for the patients with stroke. So this is consistent again with all the other tasks. These patients are very, very mild. They're patients who go out, they get discharged, they go home, and they're back in their communities, but they're still having problems with these higher order motor control tasks. This is new information because there's very little information about egocentric reaching. It has been reported that patients don't have trouble with egocentric reaching, but we have the same problems that we observe now for the exocentric reaching. For egocentric, again, the task is with and without trunk blocking with the electromagnet and no vision. But here the task was to trace the movement along the person's own arm. So we put a rod on the arm, and they weren't supposed to touch the rod, so they wouldn't have any haptic information or visual information as well. So they had to just move their hand along the rod, and when they move their trunk forward, the arm position relative to the trunk doesn't change because it's actually the arm was fixed in this position. So for the egocentric task, whether or not there was a trunk displacement, the interjoint coordination should have been exactly the same because there was no change in the actual position of the target relative to the body. And in fact, that's what we found in the healthy subject. They could maintain the same trajectory, and this was done by not changing the interjoint coordination shown here. Maintain the same trajectory, diverging late, and interjoint coordination diverging late for both combinations. Whereas the patients with stroke, again mild stroke, could not nail down this trajectory. They deviated, and the deviations in the trajectory were related to early deviations in the interjoint coordination patterns.
Mindy, I wonder if you could maybe stay on that illustration for one more second. And I'm just wondering what the interpretation is, because really when the target moves together with a trunk, there seems to be no good reason for the patients to change anything or for anybody to change anything. Because whether the trunk is blocked or the trunk is unblocked, it should not really matter. And
that's true.
Yeah, and it doesn't matter for the healthy person. So how do you interpret the changes in the stroke patients? Because in the previous example, I can understand because they have to adjust when the trunk is blocked or not blocked. Now they don't have to adjust. So why do they do?
I think it's perception. I think they can't perceive, or they don't. This is about perception, and we actually, unfortunately, didn't have enough patients with perceptual deficits. Frank, so see, perception is very hard to measure as clinically. You can measure either neglect or no neglect. That's easy. But when people have problems in perception that are subclinical, then it's very hard to pick it up clinically with our current testing. Okay.
Yeah,
so I think this is a problem of perception action coupling.
But perception of what?
Perception of straightness. Perception of straightness and location in space, even on their own body.
Could it be a typical pre-programmed reaction, so those M2, M3, because the unexpected trunk perturbation may induce those poorly controlled reactions in all the moving objects? Okay. Then I would understand. And quite a few patients show increased M2, M3. Well, M3 in particular.
All right, it could be failure to compensate for changes in afferent information due to the trunk blocking. Yes, okay. It could be, but it could be vestibular also, and it could also be corticospinal. So, so there's many different explanations.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
You also can say that patients have difficulties. We usually perform this task easily in the external frame of reference. So we cannot. We have difficulty in transfer behavior, switch behavior from one frame of reference to another.
But we didn't do that in this task.
Yes, but it might be.
It's another thing to look at.
Yes, as explanation. Yeah. So it's we easily a healthy subject easily perform the task in a different frame of reference. But for some reason, this function is deficient in patient.
Still not obvious to me because they are performing this task, I assume, not mixed with other tasks. They're just repeating the same thing. So it is always within your own body frame of reference. And it's repeated multiple times. So I'm not sure
you see the variability.
I can see, of course. Well, of course. All right, thank you.
And this is a good example.
Yeah. Can I ask Mindy, this is Leone.
Lana, hi.
Question. Hi. Was there a time limit on the task completion?
No.
No?
No, we didn't. We tried to match the time. So we asked the subject, of course, people with stroke move a little bit slower, although these people are pretty well recovered, but sometimes they move slower. So we had healthy subjects doing these tasks at their comfortable speed, and we asked them to do it a little bit slower. So what we see here in the examples and all the analysis is we only compared the behavior at the relatively the same speed, because speed is very important in task, in how a task is organized. And we also, just because I didn't mention it, this is the hemiparetic arm. All the patients were right-handed. And in all patients, the hemiparetic arm was, now I don't remember. It could have been right or left. That's right. And there were no differences between the behavior of the right arm and the left arm. Granted, we didn't have a huge number of patients. We only had about 12. So I wouldn't want to make any definite comments about dominance here. And finally, we compared the behavior of the healthy subjects, but of their non-dominant limb. And this is sort of the regular way we do things when we compare behaviors in stroke patients in order not to completely, in order to get a more equal balance between the type of behavior we're looking at.
Mindy,
this is
a question.
I think Richard Emmerich was there with the question first.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Jeroen, you're next. Sorry.
Yep.
Thank you. What percentage of the trials did you actually block the trunk? Because I think that might be an important component.
Yeah, I think it was 30.
Yeah.
It was the same ratio as we always use. It was 30%.
So would the stroke patients maybe, coming back to your perceptual issues, just anticipate that differently compared to, for example, healthy controls?
I think they were random enough that the people were not able to learn. Also, we did a little bit of practicing so they would restabilize the behavior. I don't know if they could anticipate. No, certainly the blocking was... I'm not sure I'm answering your question.
Well, we know from perturbation experiments that the first perturbation is always very different, right? Or the response to the first perturbation than consecutive ones. It would actually be interesting to maybe compare the response to the first perturbation in controls to the regular pattern in stroke, just to see if there's any potential similarity in those.
Yeah, I think we can do that. But again, with the data that we're using for the analysis was already, they had already practiced a little bit and gotten used to it. So we weren't looking at that early learning part.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Yeah. Jeroen?
Yes, so my question was in a way about the previous interpretation, because there, if I remember correctly, you argued that the patients weren't able to change their synergies, but apparently you show now that they are. So now the question is, why didn't they do it in the situations where it was useful?
Good question. I think we have that situation of not changing synergies here. Mm-hmm. This is in the exocentric task. If they had maintained the same synergy, they would have been able to do better on this task. So there may be some other things involved. It's a good question. Yeah. Thank you. Okay.
Yep.
I'm going to go on. Actually, I'm not quite... So what is the basis for the limited abundance? And now, okay, we can debate whether this is limited or not, or just reduced, but I'm going to try to explain it based on regulation of thresholds, range of regulation of thresholds, which is one of the basic ideas of the equilibrium point model. So equilibrium point model, referent control model, I don't know, it has other names as well, threshold control theory, is basically the bottom line, or one of the basic ideas is that there's a range of regulation of the threshold needed in order to regulate the activation of motor neurons throughout the joint range. So if this is the joint range, this is the gray area here between about 30 degrees and 180 degrees, let's say for the elbow joint, this is the full range. And if we look at the, in order to create any combination of torque at any joint angle, what we need to do is shift the characteristic, and this is a cartoon actual illustration of this, but we have to shift the torque angle characteristic associated with a specific threshold threshold level of the motor neurons in that joint. So we should be able to shift the torque angle characteristic throughout the entire biomechanical range in order to specify any level of torque at any joint angle. I mean, there's a lot behind this picture, and really to understand it better, you should go back to the early work of Anatole and see how the invariant characteristic is specified. This is kind of an invariant characteristic for one joint, one muscle group, which probably is not easy to measure. So the range of regulation, though, of the threshold has to be, the point is that it has to be beyond the biomechanical joint range in order to get any combination of joint, in order to specify any level of joint at any angle. In stroke, we have evidence to show that there's a limitation in the range of regulation of thresholds. So there's a limited joint range where control is possible. So instead of being able to regulate the threshold beyond the entire joint range, patients are restricted. Some patients are restricted to being only able to regulate within a specific joint range. So they're one of the most of the time, the upper limit of the TSRT is limited. The lower limit is not. It's usually just the upper limit. But here I have to show you an example where both the lower and the upper limit are limited. So the joint range, though, in between this regulation, or in the range delineated by the lower and upper limit of the TSRT, we call the active control range. But beyond this point, so you can't move the threshold any more to the right, which means these muscles are always going to be active beyond this point. So we call that the spasticity zone, and the weakness zone on the other side. So I'm going to show you some ways that we measured this. We measured using velocity angle relationships, because we can't measure, at least in an intact system, we can't measure motor neuronal activity, we can't measure the joint at rest. So we have to stretch in order to see the response. So we stretch and we get dynamic responses at different velocities, and then we can extrapolate that relationship, or the relationship between velocity and angle, to get the threshold at zero velocity, or the threshold at rest, called the tonic stretch reflex threshold. And in the healthy individual, this should be outside of the range of the joint. So we tested by stretching, again, the elbow, different speeds from 8 to 160 degrees per second, randomized velocities. There were 10 trials per velocity, and 50-degree stretches. And we also then asked the person to move very slowly throughout the joint range in both directions. And we measured activity from 2 elbow flexors and 2 elbow extensors, as well as the kinetic measures. So this is a typical response where we stretch the muscle and we get a stretch response in the biceps and brachioradialis, the muscles that are being stretched. This is the velocity profile and the angular extension. So normally, I mean, traditionally, we would be interested in the latency of this response, which was the time from the beginning of the stretch to the beginning of the appearance of the EMG signal. But instead of looking at the EMG proper and its profile, its amplitude, its behavior, we were interested in where in joint space that EMG signal starts. So where in joint space do the muscles start to become activated? So instead of looking at latencies, we looked at the velocity and the angle at which the EMG started to appear. So this is the threshold angular and velocity position for this dynamic stretch response. These are plotted, and then we extrapolate. Here we used a linear approximation. You can use a different shape, but we extrapolated that line to 0 velocity to get the tonic stretch reflex threshold. So this is an example in a single patient with a stroke in the MCA territory, and you can see that the flexor relationship is indicated here, and also the extensors are indicated here. And there's a small space in between where there's some kind of zone of control, but otherwise there's control of the flexors is this area. Any point beyond to the right of that is the spasticity zone, which decreases or increases with increasing speed because it's velocity dependent, and similarly for the extensors, but in the opposite direction. Then we mapped out these different zones in 10, these are 12, an example of 12 different individuals. And the thing to notice here is that these maps all look different. These are 12 different people from least severe stroke to most severe stroke. This person has a mild stroke, and you can see he has control zone everywhere, which means he could move the threshold outside of the joint range and completely relax the muscle throughout the entire joint range. Whereas this other person, who's also not very severe, could only have control of the joint to a specific angle. It's about 100 degrees, a little less. Beyond that point, he could do extension, some flexion as well, but only with coactivation. That's what this shows, the black zone. So spasticity is present, and movement patterns are abnormal, but movement is present. And then the yellow zone is when there's no movement at all. So movement is restricted. So you can see that there's a decrease in the range of active movement across different subjects and a different profile of that active movement, sometimes with normal pattern and sometimes with coactivation, but certainly abnormal throughout a single joint range. And we should consider that this is only really taking into consideration elbow flexors and extensors, and that all of our movements are multi-joint, multi-muscle movements with gravity involved. Then this becomes a much more complex picture. And it's already complex just at the single joint level. So here's an example of what the muscle innervation looks like when the person is actively contracting in different zones. So this is a profile picture again of that in the same vein as before. So the blue zone is the active control zone. The black zone is a zone where there's movement, but only with coactivation, and the yellow zone is no movement. So this is a pretty severe profile already of this patient. But if we place this patient at 90 degrees and we asked him to flex the elbow, he has an absolutely normal pattern. So he ends up flexing, he activates the flexor and not the extensor. Reciprocal innervation, absolutely normal, nothing wrong. But if you put them up at a different place, here's the near the border or near the edge of the zone, and ask them to traverse that zone into extension, you can see the extensors are active, big time. The flexors are also active because this person is going beyond the flexor threshold, and the spastic muscle is turning on. So this is some spastic restraint going on. So this is coactivation. Some extension occurs and then it gets blocked. So the movement is actually limited. So in the same person, you can have a normal pattern of innervation and a very much abnormal pattern. And even more marked is this response when same person extending from 140 degrees, where you get massive coactivation, and you get, instead of extension, you get paradoxical flexion. And we also see that often in patients who are more severe. So this is a question of, okay, well, there's nothing wrong with the extensors of this patient. We don't have to work on strengthening his extensors. Certainly they're there. It's the pattern. And the pattern is disrupted because of the lack of regulation of the TSRT. This is just an example. I'm going to quickly go through these because I'm almost at an hour and a half, and I was told to stop after an hour and a half. I don't know if I can or should. But anyway, these are TSRTs and two elbow flexors that show that they're not necessarily always in exactly the same spot, but they can vary according to each muscle. And that the TSRT, here's the same example, another example of a response in patients with stroke in the elbow flexors and extensors. This is a velocity-dependent response. The faster you stretch, the earlier the response. These are the dynamic stretch responses, and then the tonic one is extrapolated from those dynamic ones. However, in Parkinson patients, there's the rigidity or the increased tone is not velocity dependent, and that actually comes out very nicely in this measure because you see this rigid response. In some studies, we showed that there's a correlation of the TSRT with clinical spasticity measured using resistance measures, but not in all studies. And I don't see why actually there should be a correlation, because these are two completely different phenomena. This is the threshold, and the other is the resistance. In terms of reproducibility, it's pretty good, and we have, you can't see the numbers very well, but the R squared is 0.99. No, the R squared is beautiful. Yeah, the ICC I think is 0.78. Oh, this is the R squared. No, the R squared between this 0.78 to 0.85. It was very good test, retest, and inter-rater reliability. At the biarticular level, remember I mentioned that, okay, so the limitation in the range of regulation at the single joint can explain a lot of the movement deficits that we see in the muscle activation patterns and in the production of active range of motion. And now if we look at double joint, we have an even more complex picture. Here's spasticity zones in two-arm joint. We did this in the horizontal plane. This is gravity eliminated, so adding gravity will make it even more complicated. But this is the elbow-shoulder space, elbow on the y-axis, shoulder on the x-axis. So in the elbow-shoulder space, the gray zone here is the spasticity zone for the flexors, and the spasticity zone for the extensors, and this is a single patient. So you can see across these two patterns, if you put them together, there's very little space in the two-joint space where there's normal control. Similarly for the other two patients. Okay, so why is this important, and can we use this idea to understand learning or other aspects of movement? So, Mark, I don't know what you want to do. It's 1:30. I don't know if I'm allowed to continue or if I should stop.
I have no problems with you continuing for a little bit because, well, just keep maybe 10-15 minutes at the end to handle the questions, because quite a few of the questions are so clinical that I absolutely am not qualified.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll go on for another 10 minutes, okay, I think?
Sounds excellent.
Maximum, okay. So we use this idea of threshold control to try to understand learning. And this is an old paradigm that we did a long time ago with Numa Don-Coase, and we repeated it with Sandeep Subramanian in stroke patients recently. So the idea is to make a rapid elbow extension movement from a 3-degree target to a 6-degree target, obviously with vision, under control. There's a torque motor. This is on a manipulandum. There were blocks of 8 to 12 trials in which there was a load condition. So there may have been a load resisting the extension or no load occurred. And then we switched. So we did blocks of 8 to 10 trials with the load and then suddenly switched 8 to 12 trials without the load. The switching was introduced randomly. The person didn't know when it was going to switch, and they couldn't anticipate the switching. And we looked at the errors. We looked at whether they made undershoot errors or overshoot errors, or if they nailed it, and how long it took for them to make the error corrections. So there's different patterns of error corrections. So if let's say you're this is the target up here. So if let's say each trial is in the target and then suddenly a load is introduced, then you'll make an undershoot error. But if on the next trial you get into the target, then it's considered a one trial learning. Okay, so undershoot error, correct it the next trial, duck, 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 duck. Or undershoot error, next trial, still undershoot error, and then by the third trial, you corrected it. So this is considered to be pattern 2. Pattern 3 was when the error was corrected, but then the rest of the behavior in the block wasn't stable. And pattern 4 was they never really corrected it and never did really anything very stable. So pattern 1 and 2 are good patterns, and pattern 3 and 4 are evidence of not learning this task. So here's the example. This is an example of what a healthy trials in a healthy control subject look like. Each of the darker trials is a loaded trial, and then the no loaded trials are the lighter ones. So here's an example of the final position of each trial in the target for the loaded trial 3 times, and then suddenly there's an unloading. And of course there's an overshoot error. But so that overshoot error was made, but the next trial there's still a slight overshoot. But by the third trial, the person had corrected the error and stays within the target for the next trials in the same condition. Then we switch to suddenly loading, and there's an undershoot error. But this person was able to correct that undershoot error in the very next trial and maintain that for the rest of the movements. And this pattern was repeated back and forth. So either 1 or 2 trials were necessary for the healthy control subjects to correct the errors when the condition was suddenly switched. Here's an example in a moderately affected patient. You can see that there's a much more less consistent pattern of corrections, and most of these were classified as 3 or 4, as being taking longer to correct or never correcting within that condition. So this is just an example of what the movements look like. I'm not going to go into great detail. You can read the paper. But what we did was, in this second study with Sandeep, was we took into account the zone in which the person was reaching. So we put this 50-degree movement zone either randomly somewhere in the arm range, or we limited it so that the target occurred, both of them occurred within the active zone of movement of that person. So here is the example here with the dashed line. Here is the TSRT, or the tonic stretch reflex threshold for the muscle, for the elbow flexors for that individual. Here the target is placed outside into the spasticity zone. Here as well for the moderate patient. And then we did the same movement, but we moved the target so that the same range of motion was accomplished, but only within the active control zone. And what we saw was that in this condition, there were lots of overshoot errors. It took a long time to correct the errors in each subsequent trial. You can see the traces are a lot wider and farther away from the target. But in the same person, without learning, in the other condition, and we randomized the order, so it could have been before or after, when the targets were placed within the active zone, the learning was much, much better. And this is important because there's a big question in rehab about whether patients are learning the same way as people without a brain lesion, and how does the brain lesion affect learning. And this is showing that there's no problem with learning, at least for this simple one-trial learning task. So here again is the profile of the healthy control subject, and the one I showed you before of this person who had a lot of difficulty when the objects or when the targets were placed anywhere within the range. But when they were moved, immediately we found this pattern was absolutely looked like the... So I think this is important for understanding learning in patients with stroke for one trial learning paradigm. I think in order to understand learning, we have to use very clear learning paradigms, and sometimes that's not the case. Okay, finally, I'm just going to show you that another aspect about TSRT is that it measures or gives us an idea of the flexibility of the system, or the ability to adapt. So Nick Turpin did a study where we measured the threshold of the stretch reflex, the TSRT, when the arm was passively stretched, as I showed you before, and the same threshold when the person actively stretched, so when they did active extension of their elbow. So we looked at the threshold of activation in the antagonist muscle, the stretched muscle, biceps brachioradialis in this case, at the same time when it was passively stretched or when the triceps was actively contracting. The TSRT is increased in both of the muscles measured, the biceps and brachioradialis, when in active compared to passive stretch. So this means there's a certain movability or changeability of the threshold. And when you measure it passively, the threshold is occurring here, in this case around 120 degrees. But when the person was actively contracting their elbow, they ended up moving that threshold up to about 140 degrees. It's a difference of about 20 degrees. It's a very important difference. And this occurred in both of the muscles and in all of the subjects. So that was interesting. What was also interesting was that this change in the ability, or the change in the location of the TSRT between passive and active conditions, was related to their their Fugl-Mayer scores, 0.81. And this is a very strong correlation. And it's a very important finding because it means that there's always been a question of what is the relationship between spasticity and active movement. And does spasticity affect active movement? You can't answer the question if you're just looking at the Ashworth scale, because the Ashworth scale is only looking at the amount of resistance to passive stretch without putting it into the context of actual movement. But the TSRT puts that measure into movement coordinates. And when you do that, you find a correlation between the problem in spasticity and the problem in involuntary active control. So, of course, these are interrelated, and therefore they should be related. They should be correlated. So I think it answers a very important question in rehab. So this is my summary slide. So after cortical, subcortical lesions such as stroke, now notice that I note that we're not talking about basal ganglia cerebellum because I didn't deal with those patients at all. So we find that the motor plan is mostly preserved in people with non-neglect problems, but there are problems arising at the motor execution level and problems in the regulation of thresholds. And these cause disruption in individual joint control, coordination, problems with stability and excessive endpoint variability, and reduced kinematic redundancy, and reduced capacity for motor equivalence. That's all tied in together, and I think it's all related to deficits in the regulation of thresholds or control. So that leads to compensations and leads to solutions based on a limited set of synergies. So getting back to my first question, what should therapists be looking at when we're talking about motor recovery? I think we need to increase TSRT regulation in order to increase the system's redundancy. We want to have more redundancy and more adaptability. And we can only do that if we give people greater elements or greater ranges of possibility of control. So active control and spasticity zones can be delineated by mapping TSRTs and target muscles. We have a portable device for doing that. Motor learning or recovery may be improved by limiting training to the identified active control ranges. This needs further evaluation, but I think it's a very interesting possibility. And finally, tasks that should involve motor problem solving and should involve emphasis on motor equivalency and trying to get patients to work hard to solve the motor problems and not just to repeat some instructed ideal movement pattern. And that's it. And thank you very much for your attention. And this has been quite a challenge. I hope everybody overcame it, including me.
Thank you very much, Mindy.
Thanks for that round of applause.
A round of applause. Okay.
Virtual applause. Okay.
Right. Okay. So before we open it for questions, and first the questions from active participants, and then there will be questions that Luis will ask on behalf of those who participated in the YouTube discussion. But before we do that, I want to remind that this Saturday at noon, John Rothwell, we hope, will not be distracted with a new truckload of whatever, and will present his talk. Right, John?
Okay, yes, I'll do that. I'll be here. Don't worry.
You'll be here. Okay, wonderful. So, all right, so it's open for discussion.
Okay, Mindy, I have a quick question. This is Marco. I like the how you frame the problem at the beginning in the context of Lashley's work that has been very, very influential in terms of laying out this potential hierarchical distribution or high level and high level representations in particular in execution. I still find that work to be very, very interesting. One of the questions that came out when you were describing whether stroke in particular affects the high level representation as opposed to the lower level, I was just wondering how specific that could be as a statement in regard to the specific areas that are affected by stroke. So, if you think about association areas, you would think, okay, clearly there is a heavy damage to the ability of putting these different motor commands, or however you want to, formalize it together. And yet, so my question is, how sensitive that statement, the stroke may not affect high level representation is in relation to the areas that stroke affects? I don't think, so my comment is that it's very difficult to make a very general statement.
Yeah, I know. Just,
right? So how do you look at that?
I'm not sure I can answer that, but I can tell you so frame of reference transformations are involving parietal, temporal, and frontal. I mean, that's a big number, but there's a network in the parietal, temporal, frontal system, including cognitive, that is involved in specification of transformations of frameworks and framework specifications and transformation of frameworks. In fact, there's a distinction between transformations in egocentric and exocentric space. I don't recall exactly what it is, but there is that as well. Now, the issue, in order to answer your question, I say stroke patients have problems with, but of course, all strokes are different. And it's a blanket statement. It's too general. I totally agree with that. But on the other hand, the phenomenological aspect is that all the patients had the same motor deficits or appear to have similar motor deficits. Mm-hmm. So the question is how much is it related to what Lashley called mass action, that the mass action is preserved, but the substrate is reduced, and so the number of solutions is reduced, or the flexibility is reduced.
Okay, so one very quick question.
I don't know. I don't want to argue for a strictly structure-function relationship.
Yeah.
I want to argue for a mass distribution that's probably affected by a critical structural mass.
Okay, so one very quick question then would be to follow up on that. Do you see them value, besides the theoretical framework that they're using right now, but you see value then in physiotherapy or rehab in general to focus on the high level as the primary goal, reestablishing the high level representation of what the task is, as opposed to, say, joint level or group of joint level or kinematics? I mean, how do you put that into practice with your patients, for example?
I think we don't do enough high level in rehab. There's reasons for that, not always because we don't recognize it, but also because we don't have time. So if you don't have time and you only have like 10 minutes a day, then are you going to focus on trying to get some function returning to the shoulder flexors, or are you going to talk about abstractions of some affordances and things like that? So that's a major problem. But I think ideally therapists should combine the two, and what we call task-related training, but with respect to incorporating limited ranges of motion, or I think we have to, we can't just say compensate.
Right.
We have to say try to be better. Do the action, compensate less, you know? We have to, but to get to the don't compensate, we have to know what we're trying to get them to do. So we need to get to the impairment level. And unfortunately, therapists go one way or the other. I mean, there's very few that are trying to put them both together.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Mindy. Have you got any examples where you've looked at the effect of therapy on the things you've been measuring, like the TSRT and the synergies? Have you shown your therapists improve them?
We actually have some data now. We have a study where we looked at TDCS and personalized training over a period of, 10 sessions and whatever it was. I think 500 reaches, and we have change in TSRT, significant change in all groups. We have like a very nice effect.
Yeah, and that's persisting change, that, you know.
So, yeah, and the change is in the right direction. And now we have to understand whether the change is significant functionally. So we have people looking at that as well to see if there's a relationship between the like the MCID. What's the MCID of the of the TSRT measure? And again, we have to remember where it's only one joint. Okay, so we're measuring TSRT in one joint, and we're expecting there to be a whole change in functional behavior. So that's a bit tricky, but there seems to be a relationship between, I'm afraid to say, but change in the TSRT and motor outcome.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Yeah. Richard Nichols, you're muted. You have to unmute. You're still muted. There you go.
How's that? Sorry.
Yeah,
okay. This is maybe a little bit off the wall, but you mentioned in the middle of your talk that you thought these patients had perceptual problems as well as some limitation of the motor output. So I'm just wondering if you might want to say a little bit more about that. You know, patients with strokes sometimes have neglect. You know, could some of these limitations of the range have a perceptual component at all? I know this is a silly idea, but is that possible?
Anatole could answer that about the perception of the motor neurons. I think he has a paper on that. But note that the people we study don't have neglect.
Okay.
So we do measure, or we try to find, we've always tried to find, about 40% of the population have some kind of perceptual deficits. That could be depth perception. It could be figure ground problems that are they're sort of subclinical, okay? They don't present as neglect. But the people we look at, so we use the motor-free neglect. I forget the name of the thing. The MFVT. It's the motor-free test, and we find that we did one study where we identified people with neglect, but subclinical. So they didn't. Sorry, I'm getting. We identified people with perceptual deficits according to the MVPT, but not frank neglect. And they had problems with the David Rosenbaum task of perceiving where to grasp the plunger in order to reach it high or low, okay? And their problems were bilateral. And these are people who are not neglect.
Right. Okay. I realize you select your subjects that way. I'm just wondering if there's some more subtle perceptual issue going on here that may not be, reveal itself as frank neglect, but might be something about perceptions of range of motions and things like that. Anyway,
I don't know. It's worth looking at, and I think we do have correlation in this last study with the egocentric and exocentric. We do have correlations with their behavior and their cognitive scores. So that's executive function, motor planning, and things like that might be affected.
Thank you.
This is the other Richard. I actually don't think that's a silly idea at all. If I get one message from Mindy today, I think there is clear, perceptual probably here in your experiments, we mean proprioceptive, right? Because vision is not really playing a role, at least in most of your experiments.
Yeah.
But it also addresses, Jeroen Smeets asked a great question. Why in one case did you see adaptations at the joint space and in the other example you didn't? And that's kind of a puzzle, except if we start looking into perceptual issues.
Yeah.
And I think that would probably provide a possible answer for these seemingly paradoxical findings.
Yeah, I think so. And I think there's a lot to understand in terms of self-perception and self-movement perception, which we don't understand very much and we don't measure very much in patients.
So I think they're real. That's at least the message I'm getting from your talk.
Thank you.
Okay, if there are no more burning questions from the active participants, Luis, it's your turn. Why don't you ask a few questions that you selected from the YouTube gang?
I think Anatol wanted to make a comment about perception and motor neurons.
Yes.
Can you hear him?
Actually, I want to notice that there is a part of theory which should be elaborated even more. It's about action perception coupling, that referent control is a part of perception. The idea we start developed with Marc Zlatash being in Moscow. So the referent variables on threshold control is a part of, is a component of perception in addition to all sensory system. So this part is not very elaborated and applied to analysis of pathologies. Okay. The other comment I would like to make about demonstration of preserving the trajectory in experiment, which I call kicking in the ass experiment instead of Mindy's more modest term, buttock experiment. Okay, so in my talk I try to formulate a minimization principle that system produce change in the referent body configuration, and all system, all degrees of freedom, working on diminishing the difference between actual body configuration and the referent body configuration. And one test of this idea was a demonstration that in a situation when these two configuration match each other, you should observe minimization of muscle activity. Practically all muscles involved in the motor action. But it's a demonstration in this experiment that actually I think we can generalize the term equifinality to motion involving all muscles or most of muscles of the body. So the idea that if you involve the all degrees of freedom and muscles working on decrease in the difference between actual configuration and reference configuration. So the buttock experiment is actually testing a prediction that if you involve more degrees of freedom, making a step during reaching, the trajectory and precision and even trajectory may remain invariant. That's so usually when we talk about equifinality, we're talking about velocity-dependent perturbation and so on. But I think that this term equifinality can be generalized to include equifinality regardless of degrees of freedom involved. And so, of course, it should be perceived as in any case you have this equifinality, because the understanding of equifinality as a universal phenomenon created a lot of controversial situation and false rejection of equilibrium point hypothesis. That's I just wanted to comment.
So, Luis, are you ready to ask?
Yeah. Well, Mark, I had an idea, because as you can see, there are a lot of questions that the people made to Mindy. Maybe she could take a look on it, because I have posted all of them in Zoom chat, and we could give a break of 10 minutes, because everybody is sitting for 2 hours now, and we could have a break of 10 minutes. Then Mindy could take a look on all questions, and she could make a general answer for everything that is on. What do you think?
Well, it depends on Mindy's schedule and everybody else's schedule, because we kind of planned this meeting from noon to 2 hour time for 2 hours. So if Mindy is willing to stay for another like half an hour or whatever it takes.
Are you going to lose your connection though? Because if you put in 2 hour meeting, it'll stop after 2 minutes.
No, I'm not going to stop it. I'm going to keep it for as long as you wish. But I cannot hear you.
I'm not sure how you set it up. Anyway, I don't see.
I set it up unlimited, so we can stay here until John Rothwell's talk on Saturday.
Okay, I just don't see any questions. I don't know where to see those.
Take a look in chat.
Chat. If you open,
I'm going to stop sharing my screen first of all.
Yes, stop sharing your screen and click chat. And you will see a lot.
I see comments. I'm not sure I see questions.
Well, comments are questions. They're all numbered. There are like 30 plus. Those comments questions.
I think that if we give you 10 minutes, take a look on it, and then people can go out from 2P, for me, for example.
Okay. Well, you know what? I may not stay for the whole thing. I will keep it open so people get... So I want to raise a toast to Mindy, because we have to take a drink. Raise a toast, Mindy. Thank you very much. Luis, you may know happily that I have Salinas Cachaça.
Oh, cool.
Minas Gerais. So,
fantastic.
It's called Salinissima.
I have water.
This particular bottle is called Salinissima, and it's really excellent. Okay, Mindy, thank you very much. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mindy.
Cheers, Mindy.
Thank you. Yeah, I can't.
Now a break, and then everybody can join again back, and so you can continue talking. I hope that my computer doesn't go to sleep if I leave, but I'll change the settings to make sure that it doesn't.
Luis, you're going to have to help me with this. This is too much for me to handle. There's 30 written questions. I don't know if I could do this.
Well,
They're not all questions, but how do you organize this?
Well, if you go up, then look at the first one. Sheikh Abu made the first one.
I don't see that. I see something starting number 2. I don't see number 1. I see, number 2 is, are there strokes that affect only the trunk muscles and not the upper limb or lower limb? And if not, why not? Is there a way to ascertain spasticity and weakness in some trunk muscles? That's question 2.
Yeah, that's it.
Do you have that?
Just above, without number, it is the first one. How to identify the potential recovery in the patient.
This is a very, very, you want me to answer that question? That's a very hard question to answer. Yeah. I mean, you have to look at there are some indicators of potential recovery, which is the SAFE criteria, which is a little bit of active shoulder abduction and finger extension. The potential for MEP, the possibility of it evoking MEP in a muscle through a TMS pulse is a way of identifying potential recovery. And we know that people who don't have MEP responses to TMS pulses have low potential for recovery. Wow. This is a very, very clear criteria right now that we're all using for identifying recovery potential. Yeah. Also, there are certain predictive factors of certain scores like the NIS or NIH stroke scale are predictive for later recovery, and FMA scores are predictive. There's a whole group of people looking at predictive models.
Yeah, the question number 3 goes in the same direction. How do we determine if the person has potential capacity to recover movement pattern as a
Well, I already answered that. Yeah. Yeah. So it's a matter of whether they have the type of stroke, the time since stroke. There's a number of factors including time. It's not straightforward answer, but the clearest criterion is a presence of an MEP to a TMS pulse in the affected area of the brain. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, strokes that affect only the trunk muscles, it's very rare. This is probably ataxia type of stroke, usually cerebellar, certainly not the profile of hemiparesis that we usually see that affect upper limb or lower limb. Of course, you don't just affect upper limb or lower limb. You affect upper limb, trunk, lower limb, face, everything. It's the whole thing, except that we tend to train upper limb or lower limb separately. Okay, but everything is affecting trunk muscles. Trunk muscles are involved. Some strokes affect only trunk muscles would be those that are affecting cerebellum.
Well, what about number 5? When internal model is not how the brain thinks, shouldn't the therapist be working on increasing outcomes of tests? Wouldn't be directing attention on the joint movements be an work for internal model solution?
Yes, that's why I don't think it's the best approach. I think we want to do both, though. I mean, you want to direct attention on specific joint movements, but then you must quickly and effectively incorporate them into actual movements that have functional goals, and we shouldn't be looking for only. The internal model solution would be to find an ideal movement path or ideal coordination between different joints. We're not looking for that. We're looking for the ability to combine effectively ranges of joint motion that lead to effective movement solutions. It's not the same idea as internal model.
Yeah. Number 7, number 8, I think that we can put together. What the trajectories are defined as compensations while assessing, especially with many degrees of freedom.
I don't think we define trajectories as compensations. When we talk about compensations, we refer to the joint rotations or the movement quality leading to the motor outcome, which is the trajectory, the endpoint or performance level. I tried to address that at the beginning with the performance level and movement quality level. So compensations are not so much, we use compensations of the joints in order to change the end effector behavior.
Mm-hmm. And then, Tinka, do you distinguish between compensatory movements, movement of less involved side, number 8, and atypical movements, new patterns of movement on the hemiparetic side presented after the lesion on the central nervous system?
Yeah, okay, we distinguish them in terms of terminology. So if you use the less affected limb instead of the affected limb to perform a specific task, we call that substitution. We don't call it compensation. To distinguish it from the term compensation, which is used for doing the same motor task on the affected limb, but in a different way. Okay? This is, I actually outlined the terminology in a paper I wrote with Steve Wolf and Jeff Klein in 2009 in NNR and in Neurorehabilitation, Neural Repair. So if you want to look at the terminology and use it correctly, that's where it's coming from. Okay?
Okay. And Emiko, she's asking, do the patient's motion adaptation, changing, turn out soon or it takes much time? If it takes time, how much the motion varies during adaptations?
It's changing all the time. It doesn't come one way or the other. I mean, you can say, how quick do you adapt to a trip? It takes, if you take time, you fall. So you adapt right away. So there's some adaptation that occurs immediately and other adaptations that build up or compensates that build up over time. It's unfortunate when they become stuck in a certain behavior, and then it's hard to change that.
And Karen, he asking this is a problem of perception.
I don't see the names. Where do you see the names?
Right after the number. Yeah, we are in number.
I just see Luis to everyone. I don't see the numbers. All right, I can't see it on mine. All right.
Yeah, but I'll send to you because then we can. Well, Karen asking, is a problem of perception or a problem of faulty feed-forward mechanisms of error correction?
I don't believe in a feed-forward mechanism of error correction, so there you go. I don't think we can clearly make that. I mean, it's certainly not one single mechanism that's going to lead to this, and don't know. Okay.
Okay. There's another question. Is this a preference or less? Anatol has something to tell?
No. We just don't want to get into efforts, copy. We'll just leave it.
Is this a preference or less capacity to calculate the distance using the proprioception by mechanoreceptors? It means if the capacity to perceive using perception is damaged.
I don't think we calculate distance using proprioception by mechanoreceptors.
Okay.
So I don't think this is even a thing to talk about. But perceive using proprioception is probably part of it. But I think there's more than just proprioceptors involved. There's visual perceptual deficits as well.
Does the stroke movement show freezing of degrees of movement in unskilled individuals?
Well, I think people with stroke use all their degrees of freedom all the time. The only way or reason why they would not use a degree of freedom that they actually have is because it leads to either pain or instability. So people compensate to avoid or adapt their movement to avoid unstable movement patterns. So if you want to reach your arm out, far out, for example, and you know that there's some instability in the shoulder, then there's a tendency not to reach your arm that far out. Is that freezing? I don't think so. I don't think freezing is occurring. I think it's adapting and modifying. We may be using less adaptability, but I don't think we have that phenomenon.
Roger is asking, Roger Hobden, qualitative research might give insight into incorrect perception?
I don't see the question. What number is it?
Number 19.
19.
Roger.
Oh, now all the numbering changed. All right. Qualitative research might give insight into incorrect perception. Well, Roger, it's a good point. And yes, I think we need to be much better at measuring perception. And you're right that we should probably do a little more patient interviewing and getting more into the depth of what people are perceiving and feeling. I agree with you.
Yeah, and the next one is easy. Standing or sitting during the experiments? 20.
Oh, they were all different. The only one standing was the buttock perturbation experiment. The rest were all sitting.
Yes.
Sorry, I didn't, if that wasn't clear. I thought it was clear.
Let me see.
I guess Sebastian wants to know if there was a comparison between the dominant and non-dominant arm in the healthy subjects for the egocentric reaching task.
Yes.
Yes, there was, but we haven't analyzed it yet.
Yes.
You want to come? You can come over and you can analyze the data if you can get into the lab. Right now we can't get into the lab.
Yeah. Yeah, Stella did something as well. Let me see. Go down. 32.
Oh, wait. I think there's a discussion between Daniela Matos and Yuski Tomita, but they're talking to each other. That's okay. All right, fine. An hour and a half is too short. Thank you, Roger. It was long enough for me. Okay.
Yeah, a lot of people, they say, well, you could keep talking and keep talking. They were really enjoying your talk. Well,
okay, I'm glad. 32. But I'm hungry. It's lunchtime. I didn't eat yet.
Can motor responses by proprioception be modulated by vision in stroke patient with moderate damage?
Yeah, I think so. But of course, the visual system is a lot slower than the perceptual system. And if you look at all these tasks we did them without vision. And we did them on purpose without vision because we want to see how the proprioceptive system is signaling and how you're able to adapt just using proprioception. But of course, if you use vision, there's correction. And with vision, I mean, if you keep your eyes open when you're training your system to visually correct. So if you really want to train the proprioceptive system, you have to do that without vision.
Mm-hmm.
I think we don't do enough of that.
Okay. And what is the link between the decreased threshold rate and less or more coordination patterns, synergies?
It's less. The more the threshold's reduced, the less synergies, less patterns we have, the less possibility of combining different ranges of degrees of freedom there's less range, less combinations. So it's more fixed behavior. In fact, that's the problem that we see most of the time in the patients, which Jerome pointed out, was that the patients had trouble adapting their interjoint coordination. So in the exocentric task. So they have a limited amount of adaptability, a limited amount of redundancy. We want to increase that to have more synergies and be able to answer better.
Okay. Well, Daniela, Mark's student, former Mark's student, has asked you, and what are your insights about the important to predict potential
this is a specialized area in motor in rehab. I refer you to papers by Kathy Stinier, Stinear. Gert Quackel has done some work in this area as well. most of the models are based on recovery within the first 72 hours because that's the nature of predictive models. You want to be able to tell the patient's family within the first week of the stroke how they're going to end up, and you want to be able to move them to the right facilities at the right time. Mm-hmm. So I think once we know that within the first 3 months, the most spontaneous recovery occurs. So there's potential for reevaluation of recovery at the 3-month mark, I think.
Yeah. And what do you think about when you say we therapists have to teach the patient's problem-solving task?
I don't think we do enough of that.
Okay.
I think that's where VR fits in. We have VR as a tool, and virtual reality has the potential to be a wonderful tool for teaching patients how to solve problems if we use it that way. Not just we just repeat the same movements like do some virtual teacher. I don't believe in that.
I see. Well, this is a technical question. Why graphs show oblique feet position but not 90 degrees?
Which graphs? What number?
Well, it's 37.
37. I see a different. Why graph show oblique feet but not 90 degrees? Bernstein school. I don't know which graph you're talking about. It could be that they couldn't just draw it properly. I don't know. It's probably 90 degrees. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that that's the thing.
Okay. So an intact cortex permit a wider range of threshold control? Is that the main role of M1?
I don't know where it is. It's a good question. Yes, we hope that the intact cortex permits a wider range of threshold control, but whether it's M1, I'm not sure.
Well, I think that
it's likely, but it's not entirely. It's not just one
sense. We know based on experiments.
TMS.
But motor cortex really involved in threshold control.
But maybe
and not involved in process or.
So I think, Mindy, I think that we are done. Mark, we are done with questions.
Yeah, great. I think we're done, Billy. It's enough.
Enough is enough.
Okay, are we done? Mark left already. No, Mark is still there.
Mark, are you there?
You're muted if you're talking, Mark. We can't see you and we can't hear you. Maybe you left. Okay. All right. I think we're done. Should we just say goodbye?
Yes, I think so. I think that we did a great job. You did a great job.
Thank you. You did a great job too.
Yes.
All right. We'll see you on Saturday.
Yes. See you everyone on Saturday.
Okay.
Goodbye. Goodbye, Mindy. Goodbye, Anatoly.
Bye-bye. Have a good week.
Bye.
Yes.
Bye, Gregor.
Bye, Gregor. Bye, everyone. Stay safe. And
you too. Stay safe.
And see everyone on Saturday.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Okay. Just let me open the program again. Whoops, not Netflix. This is not a movie session. So while Mark is not with us, I'm just gonna give you what is going to happen next. Some of you, I don't know who, but some of you have written your email address wrongly, so the messages are returning. And also yesterday I have sent some messages to all of you, but probably Gmail has understood it as a fake news or something like this. So all the messages has returned. That's why I have sent all again this morning. Anyway, our next talk is Saturday, the 2nd, the same hour, Okay. And I think that Professor John Rothel, he's going to talk with us, and he's going to speak about investigating and treating movement control in health and disease using non-invasive brain stimulation. There will be another cool presentation. We're going to start at the same time. And I think that the streaming has improved a lot. And I think that all of you were able to hear very well, and as well to see all the details of the slides. And our idea is also I'm going to send to Mindy and to Anatol all the questions, so they are going to write something, not too much, but one short paragraph, and then we are going to print and we're going to publish all the answers. I cannot promise that we are going to do for tomorrow, but that will be as soon as possible. So thank you very much for everyone, and have a nice week, and I meet you on Saturday. Okay? Goodbye. I'm gonna end the transmission now. And everything will be available to watch on Facebook and YouTube.